You all right in there? You've been sitting there for a while. The officer asked with an arrogant smirk on his face. Fredrick turned his head slowly, the weight of years pressing behind his stillness. No flash of anger. No raised voice. He replied, "It's a school pickup. This SUV has been coming here every day for years." "Well, you weren't here years ago," the officer replied. "And frankly, you don't exactly blend in." He tilted his head and asked, "Got ID?" Fredrick didn't smile, handed his ID to him and asked, "Is there a reason you approached my vehicle?" Huxley shrugged. "We got a report of a suspicious SUV parked here the last few days. Just checking it out." It was 3 p.m. at Langston Elementary. Children spilled from the double doors like laughter in motion, braids bouncing, backpacks swinging, sneakers slapping pavement. Their world was still full of innocence. But not his. Fredrick sat parked in a navy blue SUV at the edge of the pickup line, hands wrapped tight around the steering wheel. He wasn't scrolling. He wasn't rushing. He was breathing. Slowly, deliberately. Inhale. 3 seconds. Exhale. 3 seconds. It was the only ritual he had left. He came every day. Same time. Same spot. Not just because Nicole needed a ride, but because he needed control. Ever since that night his wife never came home. A routine stop. A faulty taillight. And a badge backed by fear. The headlines called it an unfortunate mistake. But Fredrick knew what it was. A woman profiled. A mother erased. A life ended by someone who never learned to see black skin without suspicion. She was everything to him. Brilliant, graceful, full of fire and quiet joy. The kind of woman who could command a courtroom or disarm an argument with just one look. Nicole was only 6 when it happened. Now she is 9. And every pickup, every breath, every moment was a battle Fredrick fought so she'd never feel what he carried. He didn't wear grief on his face. He wore it in the silence between heartbeats. In the way his eyes scanned the lot. In the tension that never fully left his shoulders. Fredrick had spent 8 years in the military. Then 10 as a prosecutor. Now he was the district attorney, the one who signed off on every indictment, every officer misconduct report, every system people said would never change. And today, he just wanted to pick up his daughter. But the cruiser didn't drive past. It slowly stopped. 3 sharp knocks tapped the glass. A white officer leaned into the window, half smile on his face, the kind of smile people wear when they've already made up their mind. "You just hanging out here, or casing the school?" He said it like it was harmless. But the tone wasn't light. It was loaded. Fredrick turned his head slowly, the weight of years pressing behind his stillness. No flash of anger. No raised voice. Just a calm that felt sharper than rage. The officer didn't know who he was speaking to. Didn't know the man in the SUV had buried a wife, built a courtroom, and stood between countless families and injustice. Didn't know this wasn't just another parent. It was the district attorney. And this wasn't just another Tuesday. Some stories start with shouting. This one starts with restraint. And ends with everything that silence refused to forgive. Stay with the story. It will take you into quiet rooms, loaded words, and a justice system that never expected the hunted to be the hunter. Before you proceed, kindly click the subscribe button, like this video, because every click from you helps us to keep bringing real stories, raw truths, and voices that matter to your screen. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments after watching, because your voice might be the one that inspires someone else to stand. Langston Elementary had always seemed like a safe place from the outside. The red brick walls held decades of photographs, smiling students, retired teachers, championship trophies that hadn't moved in years. There were community murals on the playground wall, chipped at the corners but painted with care. A place that promised innocence. A place meant for beginnings, not reckoning. But for Fredrick, the curb outside the school felt like a tightrope. Every day he parked there, 30 minutes early, so that when Nicole came out the door he was already in view. So that her eyes would meet his before anyone else's did. So that no stranger's hands would ever reach for her before he did. Not again. After her mother's death, Nicole didn't like police officers. She didn't scream or panic. She just shrank. Her voice would vanish. Her grip on Fredrick's hand would tighten like a reflex she couldn't name. She never spoke much about what happened, but Fredrick had learned to read the silences between her words. And he made himself a promise. No one would ever put that fear back in her eyes. So when the officer outside his window smiled like suspicion was a game, Fredrick felt the familiar chill slide under his skin. The officer tapped the glass again, this time with the back of his knuckle, a little harder. "You all right in there?" he asked. "You've been sitting there for a while." Fredrick rolled the window down halfway. He could already feel the judgment rising off the man's posture. "I'm here to pick up my daughter," Fredrick said, voice even but firm. The officer tilted his head. "Got ID?" Fredrick didn't answer right away. He just looked at the man, young, clean-shaven, cocky in a way that came from never being questioned. His badge glinted in the afternoon light. His nameplate read Officer J. Huxley. Fredrick gave a small nod, then reached into his coat pocket. The movement was slow, intentional. He knew better than to reach too fast for anything, even in a school zone. He pulled out his leather wallet and handed over a card, not his driver's license, but his professional ID. Officer Huxley stared at the badge inside, then looked back up at Fredrick. "District Attorney?" he asked, like he was trying the words on for size. "That's right." There was a long pause. The kind that usually ends with an apology. But Huxley didn't apologize. He laughed. "Well," the officer said, "I guess even big shots wait in the car line like the rest of us." Fredrick didn't smile. "Is there a reason you approached my vehicle?" Huxley shrugged. "We got a report of a suspicious SUV parked here the last few days. Just checking it out." Fredrick's jaw tightened. "It's a school pickup. These SUVs have been here every day for years." "Well, you weren't here years ago," the officer replied. "And frankly, you don't exactly blend in." Fredrick didn't move. Didn't blink. He knew exactly what Huxley meant. And it wasn't about his car. The officer handed back the ID and gave a thin smirk. "Just doing my job." Fredrick tucked the badge back into his coat. "You've done it. You can go now." Huxley lingered, hands on his hips, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. When none came, he gave a half salute and turned away. As he walked back to his cruiser, Fredrick watched every step. Not with fear. Not with anger. But with calculation. Nicole came out of the building 5 minutes later, her purple backpack bouncing with each step. Her braids were a little uneven, her shoelace half untied, and she was holding a lollipop the teacher probably told her not to eat until she got home. She spotted the SUV, smiled and ran to the door. Fredrick stepped out and opened it for her, crouching just enough to meet her eye level. "Hey baby girl," he said, pulling her into a hug. She leaned into him, like she always did, but then she whispered, "There was a police car behind us." Fredrick nodded. "I know. He's gone now." Nicole looked over her shoulder. "Was he mean?" Fredrick paused before answering. "He doesn't matter." But inside he knew that wasn't true. Later that evening, after dinner and homework and bedtime prayers, Fredrick stood alone in his home office, staring at the sealed folder marked Internal Affairs. It wasn't new. He'd seen Officer Huxley's name in a handful of minor complaints, nothing severe enough to trigger formal discipline. Just enough to raise questions. Aggressive tone. Questionable stops. Disrespectful conduct toward civilians. But complaints from black men rarely became headlines. Fredrick didn't want revenge. He didn't want to make noise for the sake of pride. But he knew this. When men like Huxley stood too long in silence, they believed they were invisible. They believed power had no memory. They believed a calm man with steady hands couldn't carry storms in his silence. Fredrick closed the folder. He didn't need to build a case yet, but he would watch. And if Huxley made another mistake, another assumption, another mockery of someone's peace, Fredrick would make sure he answered for it. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. Outside, the wind picked up. A branch tapped lightly at the window. And somewhere across town, Officer Huxley told a friend about the weird black guy. He stopped today. He still didn't know what Fredrick was capable of. But soon he would. The house was quiet, but Fredrick wasn't asleep. He sat by the window in his study, elbows resting on the edge of the desk, fingers laced tight beneath his chin. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful, rows of trimmed hedges, porch lights casting warm circles on driveways, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. But inside his chest, something moved. Heavy. Restless. Not anger. Not fear. Just wait. It was always there. Since the night Lena died. She hadn't been doing anything wrong. That's what made it unbearable. No broken law. No confrontation. Just the wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong skin. Fredrick remembered every detail. The sound of her phone buzzing on the counter when the call came in. The way she'd smiled as she grabbed her coat, kissed him on the cheek, said she'd be just 15 minutes. She never made it back. A white officer, new on the force, said she reached too fast. The footage never surfaced. The report was redacted. The department regretted the incident. That's what the press release said. Regret. Fredrick buried her with a folded flag. The same kind they gave him when he left the Marines. The same flag he used to believe stood for something bigger than grief. That was before he learned how quiet justice could be when it's too ashamed to speak. The air in the room felt stale. Fredrick stood slowly, stretched the tension from his spine, and walked to the door of Nicole's bedroom. It was cracked slightly as always. She liked it that way, said it made the monsters think she was still awake. He peeked inside. Nicole was asleep, tangled in a sea of pink blankets, one arm wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. Her lips moved softly as she dreamed. Lena used to joke that their daughter talked more in her sleep than she did awake. Fredrick watched her for a moment longer, then closed the door gently, returning to his study. On his desk sat a worn leather-bound notebook. The kind Lena used to carry in her purse, full of to-do lists and half-written recipes. Fredrick had started using it after she died. Not to write grocery lists, but memories. Things he didn't want Nicole to forget when she was older. The sound of Lena's laugh. The way she danced barefoot in the kitchen. The perfume she wore that smelled like orange peels and earth. He flipped to the last page. It was blank. He thought about Huxley. The way the officer looked at him, like Fredrick was a threat, not a father. Like his very presence outside the school required a badge and a reason. And the way he laughed when he realized who Fredrick was. It wasn't just disrespect. It was disbelief. Disbelief that someone like Fredrick could hold that kind of authority. He picked up a pen. Today, Nicole asked me if the officer was mean. I told her he didn't matter. But the truth is, they always matter. Not because they're powerful, but because they're watched. Because they leave marks, even when they don't mean to. And I'm tired of collecting scars in silence. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, eyes toward the ceiling. In the courtroom, Fredrick was known for his restraint. He didn't grandstand. He didn't roar. He dissected. Surgical. That was his power. But sometimes, late at night, he wondered what it would feel like to stop measuring his words. To scream. To demand. But he never did. Not in front of Nicole. Not in front of anyone. He had learned to carry his fury like a weapon too sacred to draw. The next morning, Nicole sat at the kitchen counter, legs swinging under the stool, chewing toast with the concentration of a child solving a puzzle. Fredrick poured her orange juice and kissed the top of her head. "You packed my lunch?" she asked. He smiled. "Peanut butter and apples. Just like you ordered." She beamed. "You're the best, Dad." Fredrick reached for his coffee, eyes catching on a note she had scribbled in marker and stuck to the fridge. "You make me feel safe." His throat tightened. Sometimes she said things that stopped him mid-breath. Little sentences that carried the weight of things she couldn't fully understand. She didn't remember the funeral. She didn't cry for her mother the way people expected. But she carried the loss inside her like it had carved a space into her bones. Nicole had never asked what really happened. But she knew enough. Enough to ask if the police car at school had been mean. Enough to hesitate when uniforms walked by in public. Enough to reach for Fredrick's hand a little too tightly when sirens wailed. He dropped her off at school 20 minutes early. She gave him a hug at the gate, longer than usual. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "You'll be here again today?" "Same spot." She smiled and ran off. Fredrick didn't drive away. He pulled around the corner, parked beneath a cluster of old oak trees, and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through a database he rarely needed to use, the disciplinary logs for Langston's jurisdiction. Officer Huxley's name came up again. 3 informal complaints, all dropped. 2 were filed by black men. 1 by a Latina woman who said he made her nervous on purpose. The system hadn't acted. But Fredrick could. Not out of vengeance, but accountability. He didn't want Huxley fired. Not yet. He wanted to know who had trained him to believe arrogance was protocol. He wanted to know who signed off on letting officers speak to civilians like trespassers in their own neighborhoods. And more than that, he wanted to know if Nicole would grow up afraid of a badge. That he could not allow. That afternoon, as he waited for pickup, Huxley's patrol car returned. Same parking spot. Same posture. Sunglasses on. Hands on his belt like a badge gave him gravity. But this time, Fredrick didn't look away. Their eyes met across the row of minivans and hatchbacks. Huxley offered a smirk again. Fredrick didn't move. Didn't blink. The game was different now. The officer just hadn't realized it yet. Langston Elementary dismissed its students with the same rhythm every weekday, 3:05 p.m. First the buses hissed to life. Then the car line inched forward, parents waving to teachers, children darting toward familiar cars with drawings clutched in their small hands. But Fredrick didn't join the flow. He parked deliberately, same spot near the red-painted curb, just far enough from the front door to stay unnoticed by school staff, but close enough for Nicole to find him without fear. Across the lot, Officer Huxley sat in his patrol car. Different day. Same arrogance. Fredrick could feel the officer's gaze long before he saw it. He didn't need to look. There was something about the way some men occupied space, as if their presence needed to be acknowledged to feel real. He watched Nicole emerge through the school doors, a crayon drawing flapping in her hand. She ran to his SUV, eyes bright, unaware of the tension coiled just outside her world. Fredrick stepped out and opened the door for her. "I made a card for Mom," she said softly. He froze. She held up the drawing. A family, him, Nicole, and Lena, smiling beneath a bright yellow sun. In Lena's hand was a set of keys. Nicole had labeled each figure. Mom, me, Dad. Fredrick knelt beside her, throat dry. She'd love it. Nicole looked over at the officer's cruiser. Why is he always here now? Fredrick didn't rush an answer. Some people don't know how to be gentle with the world, he said finally. So we teach them. Not with anger. With truth. She nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting him anyway. They drove home with the windows down. The silence wasn't heavy. It was reflective, a quiet they both shared without needing to fill. The next day, Fredrick didn't go to work. He went downtown instead, to the department's internal affairs division, dressed in a dark, unassuming suit. No badge showing. No staff escort. He walked the hall like any other man, calm, composed, unimportant. But he wasn't unimportant. He stopped in front of a frosted glass door marked, Personnel Complaints, Records Division. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up. Name. Fredrick passed her a slip of paper. I need access to all non-redacted complaints against Officer Jason Huxley. Last 5 years. Include informal grievances. The woman blinked. You're? Fredrick Ames. District Attorney. She straightened. Of course. Do you have a? I brought my clearance. He placed a sealed envelope on the counter, signed and notarized. You'll find the authorization inside. Judge sanctioned. The clerk glanced over it, nodded, and disappeared into the back. Fredrick waited, watching the small clock on the wall tick its way past seconds people often ignore. The kind of seconds you remember when you're holding your breath outside an emergency room door. When the clerk returned, she had a folder in hand, thinner than he expected. Only 3 formal filings, she said. But a few informal complaints came in off record. People who never followed through. Didn't want the heat. Fredrick opened the file. The first complaint was over a traffic stop. A young black father pulled over in front of his apartment building, questioned about possible loitering. The incident was dismissed as officer concern regarding neighborhood safety. The second was a woman who said Officer Huxley made inappropriate comments about her clothing during a noise complaint call. Also dismissed. No corroborating evidence. The third was an anonymous letter. A teenager said she saw Huxley threaten her cousin behind a liquor store. She was too afraid to give a name. Fredrick closed the file. He had seen this pattern before. Discomfort without consequence. Power without accountability. And always fear that silence was the safer option. Later that afternoon, Nicole sat at the dining table coloring while Fredrick cooked. "Can we go to the park this weekend?" she asked, head tilted. "You promised last week." He stirred the sauce slowly. "We can. If it doesn't rain. Can we bring flowers for Mom's tree?" He paused. "We can." Nicole had planted a tree for Lena at the park near their old apartment. She called it Mom's tree, even though it was just a young sycamore with 3 yellow ribbons tied to the lowest branch. She said the ribbons helped her mom find it from heaven. Fredrick smiled, despite the ache in his chest. "Pick the prettiest ones." She returned to coloring. But Fredrick's mind stayed on the folder. Not on Huxley, but on the people who didn't feel safe enough to press charges. The names that never made it to the page. The stories left in voicemail boxes and anonymous letters. If a cop's harm didn't leave a scar, it didn't count. And Fredrick knew that silence wasn't passive. It was enforced. The next morning, Officer Huxley was already parked when Fredrick arrived at the school. The officer stood outside his cruiser, sipping coffee, scanning the line like he owned it. A few parents nodded as they passed. Most avoided eye contact. Fredrick stayed in his car until Nicole walked out. When she climbed in, he buckled her in quietly. Then stepped out and walked directly to Huxley. The officer turned, surprised. "Mr. District Attorney." "Officer," Fredrick said, voice smooth. "Got a minute?" Huxley's smirk faded slightly. "Sure." Fredrick didn't yell. Didn't accuse. He simply handed the officer a sealed envelope. "What's this?" Huxley asked. Fredrick met his eyes. "A formal request for reassignment from school patrol duty. Effective immediately." The officer raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Fredrick leaned slightly closer. "On the grounds that your presence has made multiple parents feel unsafe. And the school has a duty to protect both students and the peace of mind of their families." Huxley opened the envelope. His expression hardened. "This is intimidation." "No," Fredrick said. "This is oversight." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked back to his car. Nicole looked up from her seat. "Is he gone now?" "Soon," Fredrick said. "People are starting to notice." She nodded once. "Good." As they drove away, Fredrick thought about Lena. She had always believed in truth, not just the loud kind, but the quiet one that stood its ground without raising its voice. Fredrick was finally learning how to speak that way. Not in court. Not in press conferences. But here, on the curb, in front of a school. Where his daughter waited to feel safe. Langston was the kind of town that looked clean on the surface. The sort of place where neighbors waved at each other on weekends, where sidewalks were swept and fences painted every spring. It wore its politeness like a uniform, neat, pressed, and shallow. But Fredrick knew better. He knew how Langston forgot what it didn't want to face. It forgot the young man who vanished after a late shift at the grocery store. It forgot the complaints from the black teachers who weren't invited back after the school board elections. It forgot Lena. And now it wanted to forget what happened in that school parking lot. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was inconvenient. After his quiet confrontation with Officer Huxley, the air around the elementary school began to shift. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with protests or petitions. It showed up in glances. In the way the security guards stopped saying good morning. In how the principal avoided meeting Fredrick's eyes when they passed each other by the office. By Friday, the PTA had rescheduled the upcoming Safety Awareness Assembly. No explanation. Just a quiet edit to the school newsletter. Fredrick didn't need one. He had been here before. That weekend, he took Nicole to the park, as promised. They brought a bouquet of fresh lilies, the kind Lena loved. Nicole had picked them out herself, insisting on tying them with a red ribbon. She said it was Mommy's color, The sycamore tree stood taller than it had last season. Its leaves whispered in the breeze like a quiet welcome. Nicole laid the flowers at the base, then stood silently beside them. Fredrick knelt beside her. "Do you want to say something?" Nicole bit her lip, thinking. "I miss her," she said softly. "But I'm glad she can still see me." Fredrick didn't correct her. He didn't tell her what he truly believed or explain the cruel silence of the dead. He just wrapped an arm around her and nodded. "She sees you," he said. They sat under the tree for a long time, watching other children run across the playground, their laughter carried by the wind. Fredrick could almost hear Lena's voice again, calm, steady, telling him not to let the world harden him. "You can't raise a daughter with armor on," she had once said. "She'll grow up thinking love is something you have to fight off." He remembered laughing back then, brushing her off. But now he held onto those words like scripture. On Monday morning, a letter arrived at Fredrick's office. It was from Langston Elementary. Official letterhead. 2 paragraphs. Polite but firm. They appreciated his attention to school safety, but they felt it was in the best interest of all parties if Fredrick limited his presence at school pickup and drop-off to designated visitor hours. Something about preventing misunderstandings and reducing discomfort. He read it twice. Then placed it on the edge of his desk and stared out the window. The audacity wasn't new. It was familiar, like a wound that had barely healed before someone poked it again. Not anger. Not yet. But something rising in his chest, cold and quiet. The same thing he felt when Lena's case was closed without charges. The same thing he felt when the officer who pulled her over returned to active duty 2 weeks later. Langston wasn't just forgetting. It was trying to erase. That evening, Fredrick attended the school board meeting. He didn't go in his suit. He wore jeans, a polo shirt, and an old wristwatch Lena had given him on his first birthday as a father. Nicole stayed home with her aunt. The meeting was sparsely attended, only a handful of parents and teachers. The board sat at their usual table, nameplates and bottled water arranged neatly in front of them. Fredrick waited until they opened the floor to community input. He stood slowly, not with aggression, but with precision. "My name is Fredrick Ames," he began, "and I am not here tonight as your district attorney. I'm here as a father." Some of the board members shifted in their seats. He continued. "Last week, an officer stationed at Langston Elementary stopped me without cause. He questioned my presence while I waited to pick up my daughter. He implied I was casing the school." Murmurs rippled through the room. Fredrick didn't raise his voice. "I filed a reassignment request. Not to punish him, but to prevent escalation. This week, I received a letter suggesting that my presence at pickup made others uncomfortable." He paused, letting the words settle. "I understand discomfort," he said. "I understand it well. My wife was killed in a police encounter. She was unarmed, unthreatening, and unprotected. She died with her hands raised." Silence. Not the kind that comes from shock, but the kind that comes from guilt. "I have spent every day since then trying to ensure my daughter doesn't inherit that fear. I don't expect this town to fix its past. But I will not allow it to hide from it either." A hand in the audience clapped once. Then twice. Others joined. Not thunderous applause. Just quiet affirmation. Fredrick nodded once. "Thank you." Then he sat. The board didn't respond. But they heard him. That was enough, for now. Later that night, Fredrick sat on the edge of Nicole's bed, tucking the blankets beneath her chin. "Did the officer go away?" she asked sleepily. "He's not at the school anymore," Fredrick answered. She smiled. "Good." Fredrick brushed a curl from her forehead. "Dad?" "Yes." "You don't get scared, right?" Fredrick looked down at her. He thought about Lena. About the letter. About the way Langston tried to look away. And then he told the truth. "Sometimes I do." Nicole nodded. "Me too. But I'm not scared when you're there." Fredrick leaned down and kissed her cheek. "You make me brave," she whispered. He stayed beside her until she drifted to sleep. Then he returned to his study, opened Lena's old notebook, and wrote. "Today, the town tried to erase us. But we left our names in the room. And they'll have to look us in the eye tomorrow." The courthouse had always smelled of marble dust and old decisions. A place where paper carried more weight than people, and signatures, quiet and inked, shaped lives more than shouting ever could. Fredrick walked those halls differently now. Not just as district attorney, but as a man steadily unpacking grief in broad daylight. He no longer wore the silence of loss like armor. He wore it like a mirror, clear, reflective, unflinching. And people were starting to see themselves in it. By Wednesday morning, Officer Huxley's temporary reassignment had become permanent. The memo came through and signed, the kind that protects those who made the decision but doesn't protect those who live with the consequences. Fredrick read it without satisfaction. A reassignment wasn't accountability. It was a redirect. That evening, Fredrick sat alone in Lena's reading room, the smallest corner of their house, once filled with books she loved and blankets Nicole dragged off the couch. The sun leaked in through the curtain like soft light through stained glass. He stared at a folder on the table. Inside were names. Not just Officer Huxley's, but a list of officers who had racked up silent complaints over the past 5 years, cases that never reached disciplinary review. Some were marked unfounded. Others, informal resolution. But most simply faded out, lost to bureaucracy, or buried under the weight of lack of corroboration. He closed the folder and sat back, letting the silence expand around him. Lena used to say that the most dangerous form of injustice was the kind no one bothered to explain. The kind that left you alone in a courtroom wondering if the rules had ever included you in the first place. Fredrick stood and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting warm circles onto the pavement. A child's bicycle lay on its side across the sidewalk, Nicole's, forgotten after an afternoon ride. He smiled faintly when outside, and wheeled it back to the porch. He didn't say anything when he entered the house again. Just picked up Lena's pen from her old desk and started writing. The next morning, Fredrick filed a motion. Not a public one. Not the kind designed for headlines. He requested an internal audit of all officer reassignment records for the past 7 years, specifically those that occurred following citizen complaints involving racial profiling, use of force, or misconduct near schools. He included legal precedent, case law, and judicial support. But what made the motion powerful wasn't the law. It was the fact that it came from him. Fredrick Ames. The man who didn't raise his voice, but raised the bar. Later that day, as he walked through the courthouse lobby, a young clerk called out quietly, "Sir?" Fredrick turned. The boy couldn't have been more than 24. Nervous hands. Wide eyes. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the clerk said. "My brother, he went through something. But we didn't file anything. We didn't think anyone would care." Fredrick didn't interrupt. He let the silence carry it. The clerk continued, voice thinner now. "He dropped out of school the next month. Said he didn't want to walk by the officer's car every morning." Fredrick nodded. Not out of pity, but understanding. "What was his name?" he asked. The boy hesitated. "Tyrell." Fredrick reached into his coat pocket and handed the clerk a card. "Ask him to call me. If he wants to talk." The boy stared at the card, then clutched it like something sacred. That night, Nicole asked if she could sleep in her parents' bed. Fredrick nodded and carried her blanket in with them. As she curled beside him, she whispered, "What did Mommy's voice sound like again?" Fredrick stared at the ceiling, throat tight. Like music on a quiet day. Was she ever scared? He hesitated. Then, yes. But she was never silent. Nicole nestled closer. "I want to be brave like her." Fredrick kissed her forehead. "You already are." He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, memories did. The day Lena died hadn't started with sirens. It had started with pancakes. Fredrick had burned the edges. Nicole was barely 2 and had gotten syrup in her hair. Lena laughed, pulling her braids back and teasing Fredrick for his crispy creations. Then she left for the grocery store. They were out of milk. She never came home. An officer claimed she failed to signal during a turn. Claimed she matched a description. Claimed she refused to comply. Nicole had been in the back seat. Fredrick didn't find out until the neighbor called. The scene was cordoned off before he even arrived. Lena's hands had been empty. She told the officer Nicole was in the car. She died anyway. and Langston forgot. But Fredrick hadn't. And now, he had a new name to remember, Tyrell. 2 days later, Fredrick received a thick envelope in his office. No return address. Inside were scanned documents. Body cam transcripts. A printed email thread between a sergeant and a city council member discussing the optics of reassigning officers quietly. An internal memo labeled, "Do not file." It was unsigned, but it was real. And it was just the beginning. That evening, Fredrick sat in the kitchen with the envelope spread out across the table. He didn't take pictures. Didn't upload anything. He simply read. Line by line. Word by word. Nicole padded in, dragging her blanket. "Can I sit with you?" she asked. He nodded, pulling out a chair. She looked at the papers. "More police stuff?" "Yes." "Is it scary?" Fredrick looked at her. This child who had watched too much sorrow for someone her age, yet still believed in love big enough to bring flowers to a tree. "A little," he said. "But the truth is scarier when no one speaks it." Nicole was quiet. Then, "Mom would help you if she were here." Fredrick smiled. "She still is." Nicole reached for a pen and scribbled something on the edge of one paper. A heart, drawn carefully. "For Mommy," she said. Fredrick didn't correct her. He left the heart there, right next to the memo marked, "Do not file." Some signatures weren't made with ink. Some came in the form of small hands and quiet courage. The hallway outside Fredrick's office had grown quieter in recent weeks. Not the natural hush of paperwork and legal language, but the kind that followed people unsure how to act around someone who'd made silence feel like guilt. No one stopped him for idle chat anymore. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Fredrick didn't mind. He wasn't there to be liked. He was there to listen, and lately, people were beginning to speak. It started with a janitor. Old hands, soft-spoken, the kind of man who'd seen things no one asked about. He stopped Fredrick by the elevator and in barely more than a whisper, said, "My nephew, same officer." He ended up in juvie for talking back. Nobody believed him. Said he was aggressive. The man's voice shook. He wasn't. Fredrick nodded, held out his card and said, "Have him call me." No promises. No performance. Just presence. The next day, a substitute teacher slipped a note under his office door. 2 lines, handwritten. Check the camera footage from the gym, March 2nd, 2:14 p.m. The incident report is missing pages. Fredrick had already begun digging into old complaint records, Tyrell's name at the top of his private list. But this was confirmation. Someone was watching. Someone wanted the truth unburied. By Thursday, the courthouse copier jammed from overuse. Fredrick stood beside it, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled, feeding the second set of sealed documents into a folder. He hadn't had this many loose ends to tie since his first year in homicide. Only back then they were cold cases. Now they were warm, fresh injustice, still breathing, still walking the streets. A knock came at the door. It was Alicia from HR. Her voice carried the tightness of someone walking on ice. "There's been a request. From the mayor's office. They're asking if you'd be willing to scale back your focus on Langston Elementary. It's causing tension." Fredrick didn't move. They said what? They framed it as a suggestion. A gentle appeal for unity. Fredrick turned slowly toward her. Unity without accountability is just silence in a new suit. Alicia said nothing. She didn't need to. That night, Fredrick met with Tyrell. They sat in the back corner of an old diner on Maple Street, one of the few places that still served peach cobbler without needing a reservation. Tyrell came alone. Put up. Shoulders guarded. 18, maybe 19. Face carved by things too heavy for youth. "You sure you want to know everything?" Tyrell asked, sipping from a chipped coffee mug. "Most people don't." Fredrick didn't flinch. "I want to hear it from you. Not from a form. Not from a case number." Tyrell stared for a long time. Then slowly he spoke. It wasn't one story, it was layers of them. Stops without cause. Accusations that shifted mid-sentence. Detentions that never made it to school records. The worst one involved a late-night sidewalk stop, an officer's boot on his shoulder, and the words, "Next time you talk, I'll forget the camera's rolling." Fredrick didn't take notes. He just listened. When Tyrell finished, there was no dramatic closure. No final gasp. Just a long, empty pause, filled only by the hum of the diner lights. "I tried telling someone once," Tyrell said. "They told me to be grateful I wasn't dead." Fredrick's hands tightened around his cup. "You're not just alive, Tyrell," he said softly. "You're valuable. And you deserve more than survival." Tyrell blinked hard, then nodded. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the beginning of it. The next morning, Fredrick stood outside the school. Not as a father picking up his daughter, but as the district attorney. He had requested a private meeting with the school superintendent, and this time, he wore the title on his chest like a shield. The superintendent, a lean man with thinning hair and an eye for optics, met him in the staff conference room. The table between them was polished to a gleam, like it could reflect everything except conscience. Fredrick placed a sealed envelope on the table. "These are 6 separate accounts of misconduct involving school-assigned officers. 3 of them involve the same person. One of them involves a minor with diagnosed autism who was detained for non-compliance during a fire drill." The superintendent didn't reach for the envelope. Fredrick didn't expect him to. "I'm not here to shame you," Fredrick said. "I'm here to stop this from spreading." "And if I don't act?" the superintendent asked, voice clipped. Fredrick's gaze didn't waver. "Then I'll act for you." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. That evening, Nicole brought home a drawing. Crayon and paper. A girl with curly hair holding hands with a tall man in a tie. A little heart floated above them. Fredrick smiled, even though the lump in his throat made it hard. "What's this?" he asked. "It's us," Nicole said proudly. "And I made your smile big on purpose." "Why?" "Because you're not sad anymore. You're helping people. Just like superheroes do." Fredrick knelt beside her. "I don't have a cape, sweet pea." Nicole grinned. "Mommy didn't either. But she saved me all the time." Fredrick looked at the drawing again. Sometimes, the sharpest justice came not from courts or signatures, but from quiet affirmations in crayon and love wrapped in innocence. Later that night, Fredrick returned to Lena's notebook. He turned to a fresh page. There is power in the whisper. In the hush before the verdict. In the moment someone decides not to look away. He paused, then added, "And sometimes, the ones they try to silence are the ones who remember how to speak loudest, without raising their voice." The Langston precinct sat nestled between a closed-down bakery and a parking lot filled with faded squad cars. It looked harmless from the outside, just brick and badge and glass. But Fredrick had learned long ago not to trust appearances. Some of the most dangerous machinery operated behind the quietest doors. He stepped inside just after noon. No press. No entourage. Just a black man in a charcoal gray suit holding a leather-bound folder filled with more than paper. The woman at the front desk recognized him. Everyone did by now. "District Attorney Ames," she greeted, her voice hesitant. "I'm here to see Captain Rossner," he replied, his tone level. The receptionist blinked. "He's not expecting you." "He should be." She paused, then picked up the phone and dialed a short extension. No code words. No politeness. Just 3 quiet sentences, and then the line clicked off. Fredrick stood still, scanning the room. One officer at the far end avoided his eyes. Another looked up from his paperwork and straightened in his chair. The tension wasn't loud, but it was present, like static just before a storm. A few minutes later, the captain emerged. Captain Edward Rossner was a man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that looked carved from tired wood. He had survived 3 administrations by keeping his head down and his paperwork tighter than his jaw. "District Attorney," Rossner said, extending a hand stiffly. "Didn't expect a visit today." Fredrick didn't take the hand. "I think it's time we talk," he said. "Privately." Inside Rossner's office, the blinds were already drawn. A coffee mug sat on a stack of closed files, steam long gone. The shelves behind him were lined with plaques and pictures. An Officer of the Year award from 1998, a faded photo of him shaking hands with a former mayor, and tucked in the corner, a small frame with a photo of a young boy in a baseball uniform. Fredrick noted it all. They sat opposite one another, the table between them as rigid as the silence that followed. Fredrick didn't wait. He opened his folder and placed 3 documents face up: body cam analysis, a witness affidavit, and the internal email from the unnamed source. "This," he said slowly, tapping the email, "is a direct conversation between your sergeant and a council member regarding misconduct on school grounds. The video contradicts the filed report, and the affidavit confirms a pattern of cover-ups." Rossner didn't reach for the papers. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. "Do you know how many calls we handle a week?" he asked. Fredrick's jaw tightened. "This isn't about numbers. It always is. Resources. Personnel. Optics. You think we can function if every officer gets dragged through the mud over a child?" Fredrick interrupted, voice sharp but steady. "You're talking about children, not statistics." Rossner looked down. The pause stretched between them like a wire strung too tight. "You're stirring something that's going to get very loud, very fast," he finally said. "I'm trying to hold this department together." Fredrick didn't blink. Holding together what's broken isn't leadership. It's preservation. There's a difference. Outside the office, a murmur had begun to ripple through the station. Word travels faster than official memos, and the DA's presence was gasoline on a smoldering fire. Rossner folded his hands and leaned forward. "You lost someone," he said, voice softening. "I read the file. Your wife. I can't imagine what that's like, Fredrick." Fredrick's eyes darkened. He didn't answer. "And I know," Rossner continued, "you think you're honoring her by tearing this place down brick by brick. But there are good people in this department. Officers who show up, who stay late, who save lives." Fredrick's silence broke with 3 words. "She wasn't saved." Rossner sat back, as if the weight of the truth had knocked the wind from him. "She was profiled, pulled over, and gunned down with her child in the back seat," Fredrick continued. "And your department never even suspended the officer. They gave him a desk job until the story faded." "I wasn't captain then," Rossner said, defensively. "You were lieutenant. You signed the report." That made the air thicken. Rossner rubbed his temples. Fredrick stood, slowly. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's overdue." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I've already filed a motion for independent oversight. I recommend you start gathering everything you've tried not to see. Because silence isn't going to protect you anymore." Rossner didn't respond. The DA stepped out, and the door shut behind him with a soft click that sounded like something final. That evening, Nicole sat cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing again. This time, the paper was filled with what looked like rows of stick-figure people, each holding a sign. Fredrick noticed one of them had a badge with a question mark instead of a face. "What's this?" he asked gently. Nicole looked up. "They're trying to find the truth." He smiled faintly. "And are they scared?" She shook her head. "No. Because there's someone helping them." Fredrick crouched beside her. "Who?" She pointed to the tall figure in the corner of the page. "It's you. But with superpowers." Fredrick chuckled. "What powers?" She thought for a second. "You make people tell the truth. Like a lie detector that looks like Daddy." His laughter faded into something more solemn, more tender. "Sometimes, your legacy wasn't in the headlines or courtrooms. It was in the way your child saw you when you didn't even know she was watching." By the end of the week, another envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a copy of the reassignment order for Officer Huxley. At the bottom, a scribbled line in pen. "You were right. He should have been benched 2 years ago. R." Fredrick stared at the note. The signature was vague, but the meaning wasn't. Rossner was moving. Quietly. Carefully. And Fredrick knew something was shifting. The system wasn't falling apart. It was waking up. The morning sky wore a dull gray, like a story waiting for its truth to surface. Fredrick stood at the edge of the Langston Elementary playground, not as the district attorney this time, but as a father watching his daughter from behind the quiet glass of memory. Nicole was laughing, her curls bouncing, her shoes untied again. Her joy was still untouched by the weight of her last week. The questions, the hushed conversations, the way adults had started watching her like she was carrying something fragile. She didn't yet understand the layers. But Fredrick did. He'd grown up in neighborhoods where playgrounds weren't just places to run, they were classrooms of warning. Spaces where boys like him learned early to keep their hands visible, their voices low, and their curiosity caged. He remembered the time his older brother had been shoved against the monkey bars by a local beat cop for climbing the fence to retrieve a tennis ball. The officer claimed he looked like he was stealing something. Fredrick was 8 then. He'd never forgotten the way his brother's eyes changed that day. Nicole called out to him, waving from the top of the jungle gym. "Daddy, look." He smiled, raised his hand. "I see you, Peanut." The school's assistant principal, Mrs. Delaney, appeared beside him. She was a tall woman in her mid-60s, sharp-eyed, calm-voiced, and known among the parents as someone who ran the school like a well-oiled machine. "Mr. Ames," she said softly, her tone respectful but firm, "I heard about the internal review you requested." Fredrick nodded. "You heard correctly." She glanced toward the children, then back at him. "I won't lie to you. There's a part of the staff that's unsettled. They feel exposed, like they're being punished for looking away." Fredrick took a breath, steady and deep. "They should feel that way," he said. "Looking away is a form of participation." Mrs. Delaney didn't flinch. "Some of us never looked away," she said. "We were just never given permission to speak." That made Fredrick pause. "I know what you're doing here," she continued. "It matters. But if you really want to change the soil, you can't just dig up the rot. You need to plant something after." Fredrick looked at her, surprised. The line hadn't come from a lawyer or a cop, but a school administrator who'd spent 30 years watching power ebb and flow around children too young to know the difference. He gave a slow nod. "Then help me plant something better," he said. And for the first time in the conversation, she smiled. Later that day, Fredrick visited the school counselor, a man named Terrence who had reached out after Nicole's classroom incident. Terrence sat behind a cluttered desk, the kind that told you he listened more than he organized. He wore thick glasses, a navy sweater, and eyes that had seen too many students try to explain adult wounds with child vocabulary. "I've been here 10 years, Terrence said, "and I've seen a shift. Not just in the students. In the fear. In what they're starting to normalize." Fredrick leaned forward. "Go on." Terrence opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. "These are journal entries from a class project. They were supposed to write about what safety feels like." He slid the folder across the table. Fredrick opened it slowly, heart already bracing. "Safety is when my mom walks me home and we don't see police. Safety is when no grown-up yells near the cafeteria. Safety is when I don't have to hide under the desk." He closed the folder. His throat burned. Terrence leaned back, rubbing his palms together. "They're learning fear in the same places we promised them trust." Fredrick's voice was quiet. That promise was broken before it was ever kept. That evening, Fredrick returned home to find Nicole at the dining table, her head bent over another drawing. This time, she wasn't alone. Tyrell was there, seated across from her, showing her how to fold the edges of her paper into a little booklet. It was a simple act, but Fredrick watched it for a moment longer than usual. Tyrell had started showing up in quieter ways, dropping off paperwork, sitting in on meetings, listening more than speaking. Fredrick hadn't asked him to stay involved. He just had. Nicole looked up and grinned. "Look, Daddy. Tyrell taught me how to make a storybook." Fredrick walked over, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "What's it about?" She held it up proudly. "It's about a girl who helped her daddy find the truth, even when it was hiding." Fredrick looked at Tyrell. Tyrell nodded, his expression unreadable but his eyes soft. "She's got her mom's fire," he said. Fredrick smiled, but it was edged in ache. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She does." Later that night, Fredrick sat on the porch, Lena's notebook in his lap, the silence heavy but not lonely. He thought about Mrs. Delaney's words. "Don't just dig up the rot. Plant something better." He turned the page and wrote, "Change is not a bulldozer. It's a garden. You clear the dead roots. You give new things a chance. You water them with truth. You protect them with policy. And you let the next generation grow in the light." He stared at the words. Then he added, "Justice doesn't always come in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins in a classroom." The next morning, Fredrick received a call. The mayor's office. Not a voicemail. Not an assistant. The mayor himself. "We've been reviewing the findings, Fredrick," the mayor said, carefully. "There's enough here to trigger a formal audit of the Langston Precinct's partnership with the school board." Fredrick closed his eyes for a second. "And you're willing to follow it through?" he asked. The mayor hesitated. "We can't ignore it anymore. Public trust is cracking." "No," Fredrick said. "It's not cracking. It's waking up." The Langston Town Hall was built during the Great Depression, a squat brick building with a clock tower that always ran 10 minutes behind. People said the lag was symbolic, that Langston was always a little late to catch up to the truth. Today, that clock still ticked wrong, but inside, time had finally run out. Fredrick stood before a narrow wooden table layered with files, transcripts, and statements. Across from him sat the Internal Oversight Committee, 3 members who had heard more lies in their tenure than truths, their eyes now sharpened by what they'd read in his report. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began. "I didn't come here today as a district attorney," Fredrick said, his voice calm but rooted with something deeper, like a tree that refused to fall. "I came as a father, a widower, and as a man who believed this community would protect the innocent." One of the committee members, an older woman with silver coils of hair and a pen that tapped gently on her notepad, asked softly, "Why now, Mr. Ames? Why come forward with this now?" Fredrick met her gaze. "Because silence doesn't mean peace," he answered. "Sometimes it's just the sound of fear hiding in the walls." The investigation had grown. What began with an accusation on school grounds had unraveled into a pattern buried under procedural jargon and selective enforcement. Files missing. Officers rotated quietly. Complaints filed and left unanswered, until now. Captain Rossner had submitted supplemental reports that corroborated Fredrick's findings. Internal memos surfaced, revealing that Officer Huxley had been shielded from disciplinary action more than once, even after aggressive complaints from parents. Fredrick slid a document across the table. "This report details an incident from 2 years ago," he said. "A black teenager was handcuffed outside Langston Middle School for allegedly skipping class. No search was conducted. No weapon found. He was 14. The officer? Same one who mocked me at school pickup. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to." The weight of the facts settled into the room like winter fog. That evening, Fredrick returned home to find Nicole asleep on the couch, her head resting on a pillow she had decorated with painted butterflies. She always painted butterflies after hard days. It was something Lena used to do with her, back when the world made more sense in crayons than in headlines. Fredrick crouched beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. "She looks like her mom," came a voice from the doorway. It was Tyrell, holding a bag of takeout and a bottle of ginger ale. Fredrick nodded slowly. "Every time she smiles, it's like Lena's still in the room." Tyrell sat down across from him. "I've been thinking," he said. "You ever wonder what would have happened if Lena's case had been handled like this? Thorough. Transparent." Fredrick didn't speak right away. He looked out the window. "I think about it every day," he said. "But grief's not a machine. You can't reverse engineer justice. You just try to build something better out of what's left." The next morning brought a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of avoidance, but the stillness that arrives right before a confession. Fredrick walked through the front doors of the Langston precinct, flanked not by cameras or press, but by a sense of resolve that felt unfamiliar and unshakable. Inside the station, officers looked up from their desks. Some nodded. Others looked away. But all of them knew what today was. Fredrick headed straight for the briefing room. Captain Rossner was already there, standing at the podium with a folder in hand. He looked tired, but not defeated. Fredrick joined him at the front. They faced the officers together. Rossner cleared his throat. "I called you all here because something's been growing inside this department," he began. "Not just anger. Not just politics, but a shadow. A belief that if you wear the badge, you don't need to answer for your mistakes. He paused. Today, we're going to burn that shadow down. Fredrick stepped forward. There's going to be a formal retraining of all officers involved with school patrol, he said. Effective immediately. Community oversight will now be required for every use of force incident within 500 feet of school property. Murmurs spread across the room. One officer, a young Latino with bright eyes, raised her hand. What about the kids who already carry this fear? Fredrick met her gaze. We start small, he replied. We listen. We apologize. And we stay consistent. Later that afternoon, Fredrick sat in the back of Nicole's classroom. Mrs. Harris, her teacher, had invited him to join a special reading hour, a gesture meant to bring familiarity and comfort back to the children after a turbulent week. Fredrick didn't expect what happened next. Nicole stood up, holding her folded storybook. I want to read something, she said shyly. She opened it carefully. This is about my mom. She was kind, and funny, and brave. And sometimes when I'm scared, I think about how she used to hold my hand really tight and say, "You're safe now." The room went quiet. Nicole kept reading. My daddy makes sure people who do wrong things don't get away with it. That's his job. But he also listens when someone says they're scared. She looked up, her small voice steady. And he listens when I say it too. Fredrick's throat tightened. Sometimes justice wasn't loud. It was a child feeling safe enough to speak in front of her classmates. And sometimes, that was enough to begin again. That evening, the mayor's office called again. The committees ruled, the mayor said. You've got full clearance to begin your reforms across the district. The vote was unanimous. Fredrick stood by the window, watching the sun slip behind a row of old rooftops. He didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He just closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lena." Because this wasn't just a policy shift. It was a restoration. Not of law, but of the soul. Tea was quiet in the auditorium. The kind of quiet that presses against your skin and makes even your breath feel loud. The folding chairs creaked beneath slow shifts of posture. Parents, teachers, officers, and council members sat shoulder to shoulder, each person holding some version of a question they weren't ready to ask aloud. At the front of the room stood Fredrick. He wasn't wearing his courtroom suit today. No pinched collar. No sharp tie. Just a soft gray sweater Lena once said made him look more human. He didn't want to look like the DA right now. He wanted to look like a man who had learned to grieve out loud. Behind him was a screen, faded yellow light glowing softly with a single phrase. Community Accountability Dialogue, Langston Unified District. The mayor had requested a statement. A summary of what had changed. But Fredrick didn't bring statistics. He brought a story. When I was a child, he began, my mother used to make us eat at the table no matter what. No food in front of the TV. No skipping dinner. And even if we were mad, even if we hadn't spoken all day, when it was time to eat, we Saturday. He paused, eyes scanning the room. She believed in showing up. That healing didn't need to wait for perfect words. Just presence. And I think that's what we're doing here. The room listened. Not impatiently. Not skeptically. Just listening, the way a person does when they're trying to unlearn something. I didn't come here tonight to shame anyone, Fredrick continued. I came here to ask a question. What happens to a community when fear becomes routine? He looked toward the third row. Officer Huxley sat there. Not in uniform. Not behind a desk. Just a man with folded hands and eyes that no longer darted defiantly. He hadn't been fired. He'd been placed on mandatory training, oversight, and community reintegration. And tonight he came. Not to defend himself, but to listen. Fredrick kept going. 2 months ago, I was mocked in front of my daughter. Not just as a man with PTSD. Not just as a grieving widower. But as a black father who didn't fit the picture someone thought was safe. The audience shifted. Some bowed their heads. Some sat frozen, staring straight ahead. I didn't raise my voice, he said. I didn't demand justice at gunpoint or through a press conference. I let the system speak for itself. I handed it a mirror. He stepped back from the podium, then pointed gently to the side of the stage where Nicole stood holding a drawing. She stepped up, small but unshaken, and held her artwork to the crowd. A picture of 3 hands, hers, her father's, and her mother's, reaching for the same light. She asked me last week, Fredrick said, voice catching, if her mom would be proud of what we're doing. He smiled gently. I told her yes. Because her mom believed that real justice doesn't humiliate. It restores. After the event, people lingered. Parents approached officers with cautious conversation. Teachers talked to council members about long-needed policy changes. And Officer Huxley, for the first time in his career, apologized without being asked. Not to Fredrick. To a teacher named Ms. Rojas, whose classroom he had interrupted once for a so-called behavioral sweep. She had never forgotten. Neither had the children. He said only one sentence, I should have listened. It was more than enough to begin again. At home, Nicole sat in Fredrick's lap, flipping through a storybook she had made on her own. She pointed to one page and asked, Why did you forgive him? Fredrick answered slowly. Because sometimes the apology you never hear still needs to be given. And if someone doesn't show them how to say it, they'll just stay silent. Nicole rested her head on his chest. Did Mom ever get one? He closed his eyes. Not yet, he whispered. But one day someone will say it. And we'll hear it in how they treat someone else. The next morning, Fredrick received a letter. Not printed. Not official. Handwritten. It was from a teacher in the district. I didn't realize how much silence I'd made space for. Thank you for making us look. Thank you for reminding us that healing doesn't always mean starting over. Sometimes it just means starting differently. He folded the note. And for the first time since Lena passed, he didn't feel hollow after reading something about her. He felt anchored. The story ends here. But what it stands for doesn't. If this story stirred something in you or made you remember a name, a face, a moment you stayed quiet, don't let it fade. Share this story. Let others know justice doesn't always wear a siren. Leave your thoughts in the comments. The kind that builds conversation, not just opinion. And if you want more stories like this, real, human, unresolved until they matter, hit subscribe button and turn on the notification bell icon. Because the next story might just be yours.